My grandma told the story about Bill Long would disappear for a month or two at a time. And when he came back, he would take a sack and he would open it up and put it on the table, and it had gold coins in it.
You are listening to Gunslinger's Shadow, an outlaw history podcast about the most prolific Wild West outlaw you've never heard of, Bill Long. Welcome back, everyone. This is Adam Nickel. I'm here with my dad, Ross Nickel, and my brother, David Nickel, and we're going to continue talking about Bill Long today. Last time, we left y'all on something of a cliffhanger. We still didn't answer the question of exactly who Bill Long was, and we're hoping to make those connections in this episode. Dad, would you want to get started off on that with the whole where you left us off on the exhumation, the bones, and what we learned from that?
Okay, way back there when I was researching, I was looking high and low, trying to find who the real character of William Henry Long is, who really he was. We at the time was fairly confident that that was an alias and that wasn't who he really was. And there was a lot of thought. You know, different family members said, well, he was Harry Longabaugh, a member of the Wild Bunch, but we really didn't know. And we wanted to know, and I wanted to know for sure. And so back then, DNA was just becoming a little more well-known. This is 2003 and 4. And I went down to Sorensen Genetics, which is a DNA specialist in Salt Lake, Tim Coopersmith. And I asked him, I said, look, if I dig up some bones, can you get me a DNA off of that? And he said, sure can. And I said, well, what do you need? And he says, I want a little piece of the femur. He says, that's the best DNA that we can find on the bones. That will give us the best chance of getting a DNA sequence off of it. And so then I went back home and I looked up where he was at. And of course, he was buried in the Duchesne Cemetery in Duchesne, Utah. We already knew that because my grandma was buried right next to him, Lizerna. And a lot of their other Long family members are right around him. And so I went down to the county courthouse, which was Vernal, Utah, and went to the health department. And I says, if I want to dig up some bones, how do I do it? And they gave me a form. And I've never done this before. I thought it was really interesting. And so I looked at the form and it said, well, we needed to have 2 direct descendants sign on to agree to have it dug up. And so at the time I was interviewing Bill Long's grandson in a rest home in Roosevelt. And I got his signature. And then Galen, another grandson from the different line, so one from Viola, one from Vindy. And he said, yep, I'll sign on to it. And in fact, he was actually at the exhumation himself in person. And so the 2 of them signed on the paper, and I took it back to the health department. And they says, okay, you got our permission. And I go, oh my goodness, I never thought I'd dig up some bones. That's just not something that I thought I'd ever be doing.
You know, I think this is really interesting, Dad, because people have been trying to figure out which outlaw is which person from the time that there was outlaws up until today, right?
Oh,
and they go through evidences, like they look at census records, they go through family stories, they find old manuscripts, they find autobiographies, and they read through them and they say, oh, we think he's this person, or we think he's this person. I'm pretty sure that Butch Cassidy was this person. and it's very recently that people have started to use DNA as a means of proving who a character in history is. Now, so really, I mean, you're the groundbreaking effort, even back in 2000, 2004. The databases that we have now didn't exist. There were a few databases, but when you talk about 23andMe or Ancestry, MyHeritage, some of these other ones, they didn't exist. Autosomal DNA in the way that we know it right now didn't exist.
No. In fact, the reason why I wanted to do that was because if you go into the outlaw world and you look at all the newspapers, you look at all the books, you look at all the times they robbed banks or trains, or almost every time they was not confident of the personality. They didn't know who they was. And that's not good enough for me. Right. He married my great-grandma. I want to know who he really was. And so we need to get past the theories and get to something of fact. And it did look to me like, oh, hey, maybe we can get some fact out of it. So we applied for it, and then they gave us a actual little permit paper that said we could do it. I went down and talked to the guy at the mortuary in Roosevelt, and asked him what I could expect, and when I dig up this old grave, and he told me that you're probably going to see a 2x6 box, which we did, and what I might be able to see in that. And so, anyway, the date came and it was set. We had to pay him $200, so I went over to the Duchesne City. We paid him the money, and that was to get the backhoe to come out and to dig it. And then we went down there, and me and my sister was there, and Galen was there. Galen was right with me, which was his grandson. All very anxious. Abe was there, and we started digging. And in that exhumation, we got deeper and deeper, and boy, the top of his box was all down, almost 6 foot deep. It was crazy deep. But when we finally got down close to it, it got pretty exciting. It was like, my goodness. And so when I slowly took the pieces of wood off, we all have it on video, and was able to see his actual bones. And I was very interested in his height, because his height would identify to a certain point a little bit of who he was. He's supposed to be 5'7", and he was within an inch of that. We had heard that he had killed himself, and so when we pulled out when we looked at his skull, right there, a little 22 hole where he shot himself. And that's a whole different story. That was an amazing story that we got from that. But at that point, my only goal was to get a piece of the femur, and look what I got right here. This is the actual Bill Long femur right across there. That's the piece that the DNA company told me that I needed to have, and I've still kept this piece, so if new DNA comes by and they can get more sequence from it, we've got it right here. And so that was what started that story.
Did you cut out that chunk of the DNA yourself, or did you just take the whole femur?
That's a good question. No, he told me to get the whole femur, and so I grabbed the whole femur. And by the way, the femur actually tells how tall a person is. And so we took the calculation from the femur and identified that he was 5'7" from that, really close. Okay. And then later years, of course, when Jerry, my uncle, dug him up a second and a third time, his anthropologist did a squeeze test on his bones, and he said compression test, and you can tell how strong a man is or a person by how firm that compression is. And he said that without question. He's done over 200 bones, and he said that was the strongest man that he had ever tested in his exhumations. Well, it extends to tell you he was on his horse almost every day of his life, running and going, and very physical life.
So you took the whole femur out, and the skull, by the way, which we talked about in the first episode. Yes. But eventually you gave the whole femur to Tim Coopersmith?
Yeah, I went down to Tim Coopersmith and gave him the whole DNA, the whole bone, and the Sorensen Genetics actually cut it with their saw. Later I was blamed as getting my DNA on it. No, I didn't. I didn't touch it. And if you notice, I didn't touch this. I just touched the bag it's in. Right. So it stays DNA pure. And what's interesting is he told me it was $10,000 process. So, and I'm going, oh my goodness, that would lock us up. At that point, I had not 50 cents to my name. Yeah. And he says, but you know what? We're going to do it for you for free. And he did. He never charged us a dime for it. It was really good kudos, because he was wanting to help with this history.
The times have changed. So, things have changed a lot since then. $10,000 for a DNA test. I mean, I guess for older stuff, potentially that might still be the case, just because pulling DNA from a bone that's been in the ground for long enough might be a little bit difficult still. But
that's right.
The times have changed like a lot. I remember, actually, side note, when they were making some of these developments, like every time a new development would come out, I remember you coming home and talking about it and getting all excited about it.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, before you got the results back, and we'll talk about kind of what those results looked like, But who did you think? Oh, you got something on your mind?
No, I just the DNA.
Right. Well, before we get into that, though, like, you dug up the bones. You were expecting him maybe to be somebody. Who did you think he was?
Oh, that's a good question.
Right? Because we had talked to a lot of family members. We talked about some of those stories, and there's a lot of evidences of the identity that he carried, including what he put on his census records as his birth date, who his parents were, et cetera, et cetera. Who did you think he was?
Okay, so the question really was for me, is who I thought he was. I had no clue, except that I had some evidences. And the first one was my grandma. My grandma Luzerne, and of course I was raised with her. I was raised right down the street. And she, of course, she thought it was from that story we had last week about his picture, Bill McCarty's picture being in that book, which was The Outlaw Trail. She thought it was that picture. She says, how did they get Uncle Bill's picture in that book? And so I took that thinking, well, I think he's Bill McCarty. And then when I went and interviewed Ursula Nye, she was very closed-minded and very difficult to talk to. But right at the end of her interview, one of the very last things she says, he wasn't one of the Wild Bunch, and he wasn't one of those outlaws. But if you're going to look at that, look at the McCartys. That was the last thing she said. So when I have both of those evidences, to me it was Bill McCarty. My sister, she thought he was Tom McCarty, but we wanted to know who he really was.
You thought he was the McCartys, and then some of the family stories said that he might be Harry Longabout. And I mean, for a long time some people thought he was the Sundance Kid or Harry Longabout, including Jerry, right?
Oh, there's some
circumstantial evidence, including
right.
What he puts in all of his records, his birth date and whatnot, that says, hey, Bill Long might be Harry Longabout.
Yeah. Well, and we actually at this point think, because of some other family stories and stuff, that he took the identity of Harry Longabout. He never fit the DNA. I've since that time when we did get the DNA, and we've looked at all the Longabout DNAs. We had 3 different Longabout male DNA. Not one of them matched anything of Bill Long. We never could get that. I actually went to Harry Longabout's birthplace in Pennsylvania. I mean, that was a long ways to go. I got a picture of it, but his house. It's a 2-story house, but it wasn't that. And
so they sent you back after they tested the femur. They sent back what was then, I think, 12 markers, 12 Y DNA male line markers.
Yes, it wasn't 12. I think there was only 7.
7.
Not very many. So when he called me up, it was positive and negative. He says, yeah, we got some markers, which was fantastic. We really didn't expect any. We were just hoping that we could get some. And so normally there's a lot more than 7 markers. There's 12, 15, 30, 60, whatever. But he was successful at getting 7 solid markers from his bone DNA.
Mm-hmm.
So what that meant was there's something to go by. And so we printed that off. We took that DNA, and it took him a while. It took him probably 6 months. I don't know. I can't remember the length of time, but it was a long time. And when we finally got the DNA, then I've got it sitting in my hand. I got a piece of paper that says Bill Long's DNA is these marks. And and I thought, wow, what do I do with this? And at the point, I really didn't know what I was doing. And so I started going into the databases. And at that time, Sorensen Genetics had a database. And I, well, okay, so we'll take that DNA and put it in that database and see if we can find a match.
Sure.
But after a couple of months, one day I was looking on there and I had pushed the match button, and voila, Oscar Long, same last name. Wow, okay,
what a lucky
maybe.
match. Actually, even today, that would be a lucky match.
Well, at the time, I really didn't think it was that much because there's lots of Longs.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, Oscar Long. And then I looked him up and found out, oh, wow, he was born in Baker, Oregon. That's where the McCartys lived. That's where Bill McCarty had a ranch. Man, that's up in the center. That was really cool when I found that out. It wasn't proof of anything. It was just a good evidence. And so then we looked at that, and I looked at that, and I looked at that, and I could not make a connection between Oscar Long and the Viola letter, which has all of his brothers and sisters and his mom and dad. I couldn't make that. And so for a long time, I was really frustrated because that was kind of, I felt like it was almost the end of my line. I mean, I'm going to give up a project if I can't find something more.
Dad, can you read that letter, just not the whole letter, but the part about it's listing out his siblings?
Yes, it's an awesome letter. He told his daughter, this is what I can tell you about my mom and dad. Viola wrote it. Bill Long didn't write it. He was illiterate. So Viola, the daughter, wrote this after she interviewed him or during the time she was talking to him. The record of my father, as near as I know, my grandfather, James Long, my grandmother, Ann Long, brother and sisters, Abner, killed by Indians, and his horse brought body home. And the second brother, his name's Charles, and then Frank, and then William Henry, my father, Nelson, Lucy, Mary Jim Moss, Sarah Selena, Mary Mahalia, and those names were not in order of ages, but I didn't know which one was the oldest. Oh my goodness. But when I read that, Sarah Selena and Mary Mahalia, that was exciting.
So you have this letter from Bill Long's daughter that says the names of his family, and you have his DNA matching an Oscar Long from Baker, Oregon.
Okay, where did we go from there? So we're still not connected.
Right.
At that time, I was called as a bishop. My research project of about 6, 7, 8 years got put on hold. And so during that time, my uncle Jerry, he also dug Bill Long up on a separate exhumation, and he was able to get the same DNA from the same company, but he got one more marker. He got 8 markers. And then he hired a lady, a genealogist, I don't know who it was, and she took the Oscar Long match, and she went up 3 generations, and then she came down 2 generations, and she was able to find a family with the very same names we just named. That blew my mind.
That's crazy.
Again, this is like pioneering. That is pioneering, you know?
Yeah.
That is
Absolutely.
Any outlaw story almost never gets facts.
Yep.
But what we were given when we got that is a triangulation. So we've got the DNA that says Oscar Long's the perfect match. And by the way, it was a perfect 7x7 match. And for Jerry, it was an 8x8. But it was also the names matched. Mm-hmm. So what did that tell us? Well, to be honest with you, it kind of was disappointing to me because he was not Harry Longabout. He was not Tom McCarty.
It wasn't Bill or Tom McCarty.
It wasn't Bill McCarty.
He was William Henry Long.
He was, but then, you know, after a while, it was awesome because I'll tell you, in this world, in this research business, if any time you start out with a hypothesis and you test it, and if you find things, you're going down the right trail, and if you don't find things, you're not. Yeah. It's really easy to prove not. But when once we got this and we started looking down that trail, everywhere we went, we found more evidences.
So you received the DNA, the markers, and they matched Oscar Long, and this family, the genealogist, pulled up probably from the census in 1880 in Southeast Washington, had the names verbatim from the family letter.
That was my biggest goal, to actually find out who he really was, and we had who he really was. There's no question about it.
I think there's two things.
Nuts. Just a few years earlier, right? And you would not have been able to make those connections at all. Right. You know, before the DNA advancements had been made. You know, in order to find that stuff, you're going to have to go out to actual original records. You're going to have to dig up the papers and everything like that, and you don't have a clue where to even look. No, and yet, the DNA gave you everything you needed to do to triangulate together with the letter. And so the 3 things, the DNA, the letter, and the census records, all 3 of those things together just kind of brought it all together, you know?
Well, keep in mind, that's 2004, 2005. Now, Adam, fast forward to today.
Yeah.
And one of our other projects with another outlaw, we didn't have to exhume him to prove who he was. We were able to use autosumo. That's a whole different subject, but that's...
Yeah, no, I think there's two things here with Bill Long, though. One is, well, now we know that Bill Long is actually William Henry Long, and we found out a lot about his childhood. But also, he's still an outlaw. Like, Bill Long didn't change who he was because he actually was Bill Long, right?
Yeah.
Like, he's still robbing banks and trains and shooting people, and all of these things probably went to South America. But we know who his actual identity is. And so now we can prove that all the other stuff he said later in censuses and other things was a cover story.
It was a cover.
Right? There's two people. There's Bill Long's identity, and there's Bill Long who he was in his personal life, which is actually Bill Long.
Yeah. Yeah, my grandma told a story about Bill Long would disappear for a month or two at a time. And when he came back, he would take a sack and he would open it up and put it on the table, and it had gold coins in it. At any rate.
That's awesome. So we found out that Bill Long is Bill Long, and he was born in Illinois. And so he's born in somewhere between 1860 and 1865. And the reason why I say somewhere is because anyone that's familiar with family history records knows that censuses are notoriously wrong, or
especially Bill Long's.
And I have to wonder exactly how that happens, right? The census taker comes to the house and says, well, how many kids you got? Well, here's William Henry Long. When was he born? 1861. That's when, in the 1870 census, it's marked as 1861, and they mark him down as being 9 years old. And in the 1880 census, he's marked as being 16 years old, which is like a 4-year gap. But in Illinois, when he's a kid, and his family actually is listed in the 1856 census in Iowa, not very far from where the McCartys lived, about 20 miles from where Alexander McCarty lived with Tom and Bill McCarty.
How'd you find that?
I know. Likely didn't know each other. But part of that is because the area, Iowa and Illinois, back in that time frame was pretty much what you might consider the frontier. Yes, there were people coming over, including the Mormons and Gold Rush folks to California. People were coming over to the West in big numbers, but still in the Midwest area, it was like a launching area for the West, I would say. And they still had an enormous amount of conflict with the Native Americans, including the Black Hawk War in Illinois. There's stories of families there where there would be Indian raids into white settlements, and people would get killed, and their resources would get taken. So that's the kind of area that Bill Long's family lived in the 60s and 70s. And actually, there's a family story about that too, right?
Yes, there is, and it started out with Viola's letter. In fact, we've already actually mentioned it. So the first name of the brothers and sisters, it says in here verbatim, Abner, killed by Indians, and his horse brought his body home. Now that's the first time we've heard that story. Since then, we've had 2 or 3 other different versions of it, and we're very interested in knowing exactly what that meant. But apparently, when at some point, probably around 14 years old, one of the versions says, and it's probably from his granddaughter, says that Bill Long was supposed to be looking out after this younger brother, Abner. And apparently he wasn't doing a very good job of that. And the next thing they know, that the brother comes home dead on a horse. And so, of course, in anger, and the father was a very angry person at times, he beat him with switches. He wasn't very nice to Bill Long. And so apparently at this time, he put the blame of the death of the brother on Bill Long because he wasn't watching him close enough. That's a pretty serious blame. And so that very much and very likely had everything to do with him leaving the Long home and going out on his own.
This is the Long family is actually an old Virginia family, So they come from Virginia and West Virginia. They moved out to Iowa, then went to Illinois. And Ransom Long, who is Bill Long's more or less uncle, he's actually his dad's first cousin, but they were very close. His father, James Long, and Ransom Long were close. Ransom Long takes himself and his wife.
Now, did Ransom come from Illinois?
He came from West Virginia.
Oh, sorry.
Actually.
Okay.
But he went to Illinois for a short period of time where he launched on what was right in the middle of the Oregon Trail, which is the famous part of the American West, and an old computer game, which is also famous, right? If you imagine that family going across the Oregon Trail, it was right in the center of it, the 50s and the 60s. I think they left in 52. There's a story about it online. And not to focus too much on Ransom, but he went out with his family to Oregon in the early 50s, and he's marked as one of the earliest settlers in southeast Washington. And how that happened is they went out to the I'm going to get this name wrong, with the Willamette Valley in Oregon.
Yeah, the Willamette.
The Willamette Valley. And then they actually took a boat up the Columbia River close to where Pendleton, Oregon is. And then they went to Dayton, Washington, which is in southeast Washington, for a short period of time in 1887, and then settled in what's Patahaw Flats, or a ghost town. Really cool because you can't find this ghost town anywhere. I found it in an old history book for southeast Washington. It's called Columbia Center, which is in where two draws come together south of Pomeroy, Washington. And back in the early 1880s, this was a budding community of folks that were coming across on the Oregon Trail. Ransom Long got there first. James Long, William Henry Long, Bill Long's dad, came out and met his first cousin and is listed in the 1880 census right next to his cousin there in Columbia Center. They had a sawmill. The blade for the sawmill is still in Pomeroy. They had a few taverns, apparently, a store, and a lot of fresh breed cattle brought in by the surname Pomeroy. The Pomeroy family brought in the best cattle from anywhere to Pomeroy, Washington, and they grazed them up on the Blue Mountains, which is in southeast Washington and in northeast Oregon.
So, by the way, for anyone listening to this is what David does. David puts his military intelligence chops and all that sort of stuff to work. He makes connections that I don't know how he finds all this stuff.
That
anyway,
brings the story alive.
I mean, it's the same thing with Dad. Dad does the same thing, but Dad's is more like in person, going to the original records, traveling all over the place. David is just like internet guru, really good at finding random stuff and putting it all together, and not just finding them, but there's those movies about Sherlock Holmes or whatever. You got those detectives tracking down the bad guy, and they got that mind map taped up on the wall, and all the yarn going all over the place. David does that in his computer.
Yeah. This is true. I think it's so fun to make these connections. And really the question is, because Dad did all of this work to find out, well, who is Bill Long? He's Bill Long. Here he is. So why is he an outlaw? Right? And so we're looking at the records and we're saying, okay, we know he's 16 years old, and in the census he's marked in Columbia Center, an old ghost town now. Where did he get involved with the outlaws?
I mean, because of all of the family stories, there's no question. There's no question he was an outlaw in our minds. I mean, we knew that that's who he was, but of course that changed. So my objective was to find out who he was, and we found that out. That changed everything. So now it's not who was Bill Long, it's what was Bill Long's part in the outlaw world. That's where we changed.
So if the last two episodes weren't a big enough hint for y'all, we were setting things up in order to get up to this point where we have the McCarty brothers up in the Oregon, Washington area, close to the Blue Mountains. And also we mentioned Hank Vaughan, right? And both of those names, I guess all those names should ring a bell for the deeper Wild West outlaw history researchers out there. But Hank Vaughan and the McCarty brothers, they had something of a cattle rustling operation, right? They had something going on up there with the Blue Mountains.
No doubt. They were, I mean, Hank Vaughan first, who was married to a McCarty sister. And then the McCartys also, Tom McCarty went around the West incessantly stealing cattle. In his autobiography, he's in New Mexico, in Utah, in Arizona, in Oregon, Nevada. He's all over the place. He steals cattle. He changes the brand. He sticks them on a train and he sells them. That's what he does. That's how he makes money. And that's not an uncommon story for cowboys in the West, right, Dad?
No, that's very common. I mean, the one was just real quick. Him and Matt Warner and Joshua Sweat, they got a bunch of cows down there in the very southern border. Might have been in Mexico, really close around Nogales area, and they picked up a whole bunch of them. They did exactly the way you said it, David. They rounded them up. They had them figured out how to get them on that big train. They made the deal. They took the cash. They took off running, and of course there was a posse chased them for days, nights, 24/7. And the only reason why they got away is they got a police ferry on the crossing of the Colorado River. And it was finally there they were able to lose them. Joshua Sweat got shot in the lungs. He quit outlaw work after that.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
I mean, Hank Vaughan, this kind of very strange character in Northeast Oregon, he's well known for rustling. He's well known for stealing cows. And at that point, the Pomeroy breeds of cattle were they were sought after in that whole area. So one of the things the McCartys did with Hank Vaughan is that they would steal horses and cows in and around the reservations in Northeast Oregon, and then they would take the stolen horses up through the Blue Mountains or around the Blue Mountains. And I want you to get out a map if you're listening to this. And
That's right.
you look at, you can center yourself around Athena, Oregon, pretty close to Pendleton. And they took these horses up to pretty close to Lewiston, Idaho, to the Nez Perce Reservation, and they would sell these stolen horses to the Native Americans because they could get away with it. And they did this for years, in the 80s, and probably a little bit in the early 90s, but mostly in the 80s.
It wasn't a small operation. It was a big operation, tens of thousands of animals.
Right.
All this while Hank Vaughan's being reported in the newspaper as like breeding monkeys and fighting a bear and all sorts of other random weird stuff. I mean, the guy was nuts.
He was a character, and in the articles that you're talking about, Adam, his gang of cowboys is often listed. He always had his guys that were working for him. They would come into town and they would cause trouble and they would shoot off guns and beat people up, and it's just a kind of an interesting character. But so again, if you're looking at a map and you're looking at Athena, Oregon, and you're looking at Lewiston, Idaho, and you draw a line between the two, and you don't go over those 12,000 foot mountain peaks, you have a ghost town called Columbia Center.
Columbia Center. I've been there. It's quite a place.
You've been there, Dad?
Yeah. We went up to Pajada Flats. Went up to Pomeroy. In fact, what was interesting, I've been up there. I went up to Pomeroy, Washington before I knew that the McCartys and Hank Vaughan had anything to do with it. Mm-hmm. I was interviewing and looking for McCartys, and there was a lady that lived up there, and I went up to interview her a long time ago, probably 2006, 2007, and went right down Pomeroy, and I can remember talking to her about it, and she had all these really good pictures of the McCartys, which I have today. She's now passed on, doesn't have them no more, and she don't live there no more. But that was before I had any clue that William Henry Long lived in that town.
Yeah. And at some point he left his family, and the family stories disagree a little bit on what age that is. But we know that in 1880 he's with them, or at least that they're listing him as with them.
I mean, I guess before we get to that, though, there was one other family story that I think is very important with William Henry Long as a kid. It's one of my favorite stories, honestly, of the guy. I mean, it really highlights kind of his personality as something of a rebellious sort of kid. You know, the gist of it is just the whole relationship he had with his preacher, right?
Yep. Yeah, I was interviewing one of his granddaughters, one of Bill Long's granddaughters, and she told me this story, and I just couldn't believe it. It was really a crazy deal. And so apparently this is the way that it went. So it must have been James Long, his dad, and the preacher, and it probably was in Pajada Flats or Columbia Center, and they would go to church. His dad would go to church with this preacher. So after the sermons was done and they went home, James Long had a relationship with the preacher, and so James Long would sit down with the preacher on the front porch, and they would tell all the stories of the day. Bill Long being kind of a troublemaker and young, probably 16, according to the story we have, but it was young. Bill Long got this hot idea. He decided that he was good because he really didn't like church, and he really didn't like his dad either, and he probably didn't like the preacher. I don't know, never asked him, but so he decided to take the preacher's pipe, the smoke pipe, and so this was probably in the middle of church when they were doing their thing, and he took the big part, and he took out the tobacco out of the pipe, and he poured into it gunpowder. And then he took the little tobacco wad and kind of put it back on the top of it, and so nobody knew there was gunpowder inside of this preacher's pipe. And of course, as you can imagine, after church, when James Long and the preacher was sitting down to do their talk, of course, the preacher lights it, but you know what? We don't even know what happened then. Our side of the story says Bill Long knew he was in big trouble with his dad. He knew that life was over. And so he went out, according to this story, he went out and he got his horse saddled and he loaded it up with all the food he could get, and he left town never to come back. Mm.
Oh man,
that's good stuff right there.
Yeah, tough times, boy. Oof.
Yeah. So I think you can put one and one together, and you could probably figure out where Bill Long rode off to. And it may have been at the same point or sometime close to when the McCartys and Hank Vaughan are riding through with a bunch of stolen horses.
Well, and I don't know if we want to go over that, but we'll go over a little bit of it. But in the letter, it states that Bill Long went to a cowboy camp. My goodness. Okay, so how many cowboy camps are around Pajada Flats? Anybody knows, but we do know that there was one, a big one.
I mean, at the same time, you take a look at the type of character Bill Long was as a kid, I imagine he had something of a rough relationship with his dad, not really getting along with him, wanting very much to rebel, assert his, independence, I guess. And being the times it was, he knows his way around horses. He knows his way around the wilderness. He knows his way around. He knows how to survive out there, right? Already is like a 16-year-old kid, okay? And there he is, wanting to kind of assert his dominance, be himself, It sounds almost like something he would have planned, right? The whole black powder thing is just like a sayonara, see you later, Just like, I'm done with this. I'm out of here,
Well, along the same thought process, I would imagine he had already met Hank Vaughan, and he already met Tom McCarty, or one of them.
Right. Hank Vaughan was not an unknown figure.
He
likely read about him in the newspaper, probably talked about him in family things. Hey, there's a cowboy over there. Runs cowboy camp, steals cows.
Yeah. I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall when he came into camp as a 16-year-old kid and said, "Hey guys, I'm done with home. I'm not going back. Have you got a place for me?" I mean,
and we'll do a video, I think, on the YouTube channel about the map, about how the geography of it all lines up. I mean, that whole operation was in this area, and without actually seeing it on the map, it's going to be really difficult to kind of understand it. But basically, once you see it on the map, it just clicks. It's just like, there's no way. There is just no way. If they're driving cattle through there, they are taking them right through
Probably
Columbia
stopped
Center.
there at the local taverns, most likely.
Yeah.
Well, and then our story, and we're going to, I'm assuming, cover this at a different time, but when we bring back in that sister's picture and all of that stuff, and about his dad looking, and about his brother and all of that, my goodness, that's a whole another story.
This is an outlaw story.
I don't know. This whole thing sounds like
It
a
does.
Western fairy tale. It really does.
Well, at the same time, Adam, you can create a story, and you can get as creative as you want to get, but nothing compares to the excitement of a real story. And so that's what we're following, is that real story.
Absolutely true.
If you understand the times, if you understand what's going on there, I mean, it's a really interesting story. And this is where it all begins. The Blue Mountains, up between Washington and Oregon, and right close to Idaho. That northern tip of the Blue Mountains is like the epicenter of everything, and we'll tie it all together. But basically, I mean, it's pretty much a done deal. He did get together with Hank Vaughan and the McCarty brothers up in the Blue Mountains.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. Until next time.
All right.
Thank you for listening to Gunslinger's Shadow. We hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new about one of the most mysterious and elusive outlaws of the Wild West. If you have any information about Bill Long, the Robbers Roost Gang, or any other Western outlaws from the late 1800s, maybe you are a descendant of Bill Long, or of the Parker family, the Butch Cassidy family, the McCartys, or just have family stories that have been waiting generations to tell, we want to hear from you. Your story may well be the missing link that turns fiction into facts. We are right now actively researching the origins of Bill Long and the other outlaws he knew. So please, send us an email with the stories you want to share. We'll read every message and respond as soon as we can. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to, and join us for our next episode to find out the real story behind the real outlaws of the real Wild West.